Hello, everyone, and welcome to 180 Degrees of Impact. My name is Matt Scott, and today I am thankful to be joined by Precious Stroud. Precious, how are you doing?
I'm good, Matt. Thanks for having me. I'm excited to learn more and to share.
Thank you, and I definitely am. That's part of the reason that I want to have you as part of this. And I just want to say, before even really diving into it, that one thing I love about 180 Degrees of Impact is that, like, I just happened to see an interview that you did with Charmaine Mercer, formerly who was with the Alliance for Excellent Education, and you never know where you're going to meet people who are making a positive difference. So thank you for doing the work you do and being so public about getting it out there, because otherwise we probably wouldn't be connecting right now.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you.
Thank you, and thanks to Charmaine, since you mentioned her, who was a great supporter of our project in DC.
Awesome. And so I just want to dive all the way in. And as we get started, I'm sure people are wondering who you are and how you describe yourself. So I'd love for you to introduce yourself to the 180 Degrees of Impact audience, however you feel comfortable introducing yourself.
Well, thank you, Matt. My name is Precious Stroud, and I am from Berkeley, California. Have been in the Bay Area the majority of my professional career and my childhood. I'm super excited about 100 Degrees of Impact because I, like you, believe that like the positive stories are out there, but they just don't get the exposure sometimes. And so there's those of us who are working to tell those stories for lots of reasons, really for personal inspiration, but also because the world isn't that dark. And we really are all working for the same thing, no matter where you go, whether you're in Singapore or, Johannesburg or, Belgium for that matter. I mean, you hear the same stories. I want to take care of my kids. I want to be able to, not go to war. Like I want to be able to just have a peaceful life. And so, and add value to that community or village or whomever it is that one might belong to. So I know it's not always the story we hear, but I do think it's part of what inspires and motivates me.
Yeah.
I think as a through line from a young person, just wanting to find my voice, share my voice, and being told I talk too much, and then coming full circle, and then saying, wait a minute, but if I don't say something, then how will people know? Like what I think and what I feel, and why shouldn't I feel confident about what I have to say? So it's been mostly a healing journey for me, which led me to discovering other people and listening to their stories and then helping them tell their stories.
Amazing. And so I think that's a great point too, because it is really difficult for people. It is really difficult for people to know when it's okay for them to speak up sometimes, right? And so I'm wondering, I think, I mentioned really first, my introduction to you was through the interview that I saw with Charmaine, and her piece is part of Black Female Project. Could you talk about what Black Female Project is? And I think as part of that, why you started the project?
Sure. So Black Female Project is an effort to celebrate Black women who thrive at work, right? But kind of the second line is to prepare Black women for the realities of the workplace. That really was the whole purpose. I had gone through some things, and we can talk about more of that later, that led me to the point where I thought, you know what, I need to do some writing and some healing. Like, I'm going to trust that the writing process will be healing. And then I'm going to believe that through that I can share my story, and maybe it'll help somebody else. I mean, here I am, born and raised in Berkeley, California, supposed to be like, ultra progressive, and my parents, art, poetry, teachers, educators, and Panther. I mean, this is where all of the places where all of this generation of a fight and a struggle was manifest. Yet I didn't feel prepared for what I was facing in the workplace. And I think a part of that was just that generation that came before us, or generation and a half ago, that worked so hard to get us presence in certain places. But we don't know some of the things that they literally went through day to day to kind of keep their sanity and stay focused. And we also know community was situated a little differently then. I know you're on the East Coast and I'm on the West Coast, and there's some conversations about regionally what community means.
Mm-hmm.
But to go back to the answer to that question more specifically, I think the Black Female Project was my way of telling my story. And then I realized if I wanted to be helpful for young girls or for young adults, I sure better have more than mine, right? So like I have to start asking people to share their stories, and I thought it would be an anthology.
Mm-hmm.
And that's it. And then, I mean, the women who started writing were like, look, two of them came to me separately. One said, I'm in IT, I don't really know what this writing thing is about. Like, what are other people writing about? Can I talk to them?
Mm-hmm.
Another woman, and that was my sister Fern Stroud.
Right.
Then another woman who was a huge supporter, even at the onset, Danya Frank.
Okay.
Danya said, I need to be, she said, I appreciate being reflective about what I've gone through and how I navigate racism and sexism in the workplace, which again is part of this, the project is, how do you navigate racism and sexism in the workplace? Mm-hmm. And what lessons learned would you pass to the roles coming behind us? And part of that is about deconstructing and demystifying how what we call institutional racism, but basically how oppression shows up in little ways and big ways every day at work. And we just kind of brush it off, or we work around it, and we are all successful.
Yeah.
But how often do we stop and say, wait a minute, what just happened? How do I feel? Who did I talk to help me get through it? Mm-hmm. What is that called? Why is it pervasive, or why does it persist? Mm-hmm. That's what we're trying to document, so that, the girls coming behind us make a different mistake, but you don't have to make the one I made.
Yeah.
It doesn't have to be a personal attack on your humanity. It actually is just a set of strategies that have worked for a long time, and we're going to move past them.
Yeah, that's really interesting to think about what you're doing, because it reminds me a lot of, or even just this kind of I'll say the story of what you're trying to create and how it evolved, because it reminds me of 180 Degrees of Impact, being passionate about impact, mm-hmm. but also recognizing that a lot of the best perspectives, or even just in general, not even best perspectives, but having more perspectives really gives you a bigger picture of any issue. And so I really appreciate and admire that you're taking that approach. And I think another thing I really admire with the Black Female Project is that it seems like there's really, like, at least this budding community where people are connected. You started to talk a little bit about, the experiences that you went through that feed into why you do what you do. But could you talk a little bit more about that? And in turn, how this community you're creating is sort of, I don't want to say a solution, but is addressing that experience for Black women?
Yeah, probably the most succinct way to talk about it would be to talk about the isolation. So what happened for me was I was trying really hard at work over and over again. I met some obstacles that would be totally normal. People would say, that's just the way it is. It's a Shark Tank out there. Like, get with it. Mm-hmm. And, but there were things that were unique that I saw over and over again with women of color in particular. And then with Black women, just like way too much work. Like, it's okay, take on an extra stretch project. But this notion that not every time, I won't, but quite often, a Black woman leaves a job, it takes 2 or 3 people to replace the amount of work she was doing. Mm-hmm. Because there is this notion, and, there's been tons of research, and people have said this in a beautiful way, just kind of keeping it real short and sweet. They're a workforce. There's not respect for my femininity in the workplace. No, this isn't everywhere. Yeah. But, the pervasive nature is that through oppression, I can be controlled. Whereas with white women, it's through subjective, like be subjective, be like really passive, like be okay with the man doing what he does. Whereas with Black women, it's like, no, I'm going to force you, right? Because this is what you're supposed to do. You should be grateful that you have a job. Whereas the converse, we're all adding our talents to the table, and so shouldn't they all, and won't they all be appreciated? So what happened for me is that because I was working so hard and thought that the feedback I was getting was genuine for my own benefit, I believed it. And so I worked so hard. I became isolated from reality, isolated from my family. There's this notion, and isolated in the workplace, being the first often, some of us are the first or the only in these professional environments.
Right.
And there's this expectation. We have to come back to why that made you smile.
Yeah, and we will definitely come back to that because we'll get back to that. But also, it's a story that ties in with Charmaine a little bit too, and because she's part of my professional experience, really. But we'll get into it.
Okay.
Yeah.
So you asked about how the community was kind of answering that, and I think I would have never articulated this way until you said that. But the isolation is answered by the community. Wow. I didn't know I necessarily needed the community. I thought I needed to create something for someone else. Mm-hmm. And here I am now in this community where I'm constantly engaging with Black women who are not only thriving, but in varying degrees of self-awareness and okayness with Blackness, right? Because Blackness, in whatever definition it is sometimes welcome and sometimes not. And then people are taking off a little here and there, and you get 10 years down the road and you're like, well, who am I?
Yeah.
Like, who am I? Can I define that? Like, can I articulate that? Because we get lost along the way sometimes. So I now have this incredible community, and I never get to talk about it in terms of me. So thank you very much. Because I'm always talking about, like, what can we do? How can we create these spaces for women to have this conversation? We talk a lot about wearing the mask, right? So like, I'm like, I throw the mask away, like burn it. But some people, you got to put the mask on from time to time, where they have elements of it that they still kind of are working through. I've had a very senior mentor of mine tell me once, you can wear your hair like that because you live in the Bay Area, Precious, right? And that's now.
Yeah.
So I think that community is answering isolation, but that isolation is a tactic that can destroy, because you're not nurturing yourself. You're chasing this thing that will never you can never achieve, because you can't please someone who doesn't see you as successful based on their own bias. Mm-hmm. So since I'll never be successful, yet you keep telling me to try, now I'm caught in this circle, and then it creates physical ailments and other things. So I'm healed through, it is my own healing process. I can selfishly say that today. Thank you.
No, I appreciate that. And I'm really glad you mentioned the point where I just kind of chuckled, because it's so real. And it's funny. It's funny because I was reading Charmaine's story and then listened to the podcast interview with her. And I was really interested in it because I graduated from college here in DC in 2014. Mm-hmm. And right after that, I started working with a company doing a lot, like basically what I studied, which is marketing. And I was doing digital marketing. And one of my best clients was the Alliance for Excellent Education, like great people. But and I guess maybe it's not a but just a reality is that, like, in the company where I worked, there were different periods of time, when you're working at a place where you're the only Black person, and then maybe there's another Black person who's there for like for a point in time, or maybe they're there the whole time. Like Charmaine said in one of her in the podcast interview and in writing, sometimes you're the only one, if not one of the only ones. And so I was in that experience, and one of my first experiences, from what I remember, really working with, like just in a room with multiple Black people. It took a while before it was multiple other Black men, and that's a whole other story. But one of those first experiences with me, Charmaine, another person by the name of Tina Dove, and there, we have other people there, was with her. And so it was interesting to experience that, because I know in so many of her experiences, as senior as she is in the work that she's doing at this point, there's still that recurring theme of, as you were saying, like isolation in your identity. And I still experience that. I mean, the question is, and I don't think it has an answer yet, but like, will that continue? And I think that it's interesting that you are creating conversation around that isolation. So thank you for doing that. I'm curious, are there any, I mentioned Charmaine and I keep mentioning her, and I will definitely be sure that I send this through to her. Because and by the way, I just want to say, to follow up on that, because I don't think I closed the loop on that thought around working with her. For me, that provided a sense of comfort, seeing that I was not entirely completely different from everyone who I professionally was worked with or tasked with working with. And so that's what I saw. But I'm curious, are there any insights that stand out to you from the conversations that you've had, or from really from the stories that you're telling through Black Female Project?
Yeah, so there are a few. I mean, there's one takeaway that we have documented, and it may not be a secret, but number one is a sense of identity. So around Blackness, particularly, so Black identity. And some of the ways, what happened is that first year we had these conversations where I just thought we were supporting people through the writing process, and that would be it. Well, these things rose out. So there were three. One was Blackness and self-identity, one, and confidence in that. The other one was, and you still have to get what you need from your bosses and your clients, right? So there's some leadership development that needs to happen. And then the other one was around self-care and caring for your whole self, not neglecting yourself along the way. So we kind of say, like, you're Black in this society, and sometimes you're going to face some obstacles and it's going to hurt. And you still need to take a look at that, depersonalize the things that are not personal, decide what you want to do, and move forward. And then along the way, be okay with what the decisions that you make, and understand that you have to keep your wholeness intact.
Yeah.
We can decide to, we've heard women position things as bullying instead of trying to make it a race issue, just to move it forward in their human resources departments, to women then now affirming one another. So the affirmation is huge. That's the other thing, making sure people have some sort of community. And I know we've heard this like our whole lives, like, have a community, right? Like, but what it really means is that someone is telling you you're not crazy. Because what happens is just everything's going on, you're trying to figure it out, and then you get kind of isolated because you're trying to figure it out, and you're like, but I should be able to do this. And then people are saying things to you to make you question yourself, because that's part of the strategy, right? If I can get you off step, like missing your step, I can then swoop in underneath you. And there's several ways to do that. And so if you can identify it before it comes and keep a level head, you can navigate. That's why we talk about it as navigating racism and sexism in the workplace, not solving it necessarily. Although in my heart of hearts, I believe that the more women who kind of say, you know what, actually, I'm not, this is how I'm going to get down, and you can choose to treat me this way, but I'm going to decide to manage that this way. So then by the fifth time, like, not the first woman, maybe you don't get it, maybe the second or third, maybe the fourth or fifth. But you're going to treat somebody differently as a result of your experience with me. But I've been told by many people, like, that's nice, Precious. Yeah. They're not as optimistic.
Yeah. That's like, that's so interesting, and that's a tough pill to swallow. But I'm really glad you said that, because I think, like, one thing I do in these interviews sometimes is reference things that happened before talking. So, like, for instance, we were talking, I mentioned how, like, my dad passing away and my experience with grief, and how that motivated 180 Degrees of Impact. But I actually haven't stopped to think about that, or really about, I haven't stopped to think about it in a way that's like, how does this kind of distract me from what I'm always trying to do? I think you always need to make space for your identity, but I guess what I'm trying to get at is that Black women in particular, and I'll also say other people for a variety of reasons who are going through some sort of struggle, whether that's poverty or, whatever that might be. There are a million issues that you could go through, but Black women have this, like, added kind of, it's like you're wearing a backpack that's full of, like, bricks, on top of everything else. And sometimes there are people putting more bricks into your backpack. That's kind of what it sounds like to me if I had to make an analogy based on what you were saying. But
Mhm.
does that kind of capture what, I mean, that's me oversimplifying, but does that kind of capture the sentiment?
Mhm. Well, I mean, society has its how it positions us.
Yeah.
And so in society, if you want to know about racism, talk to somebody Black, right?
Yeah.
You want to know about sexism, talk to a woman. So if you take a Black female perspective, certainly there are societal ills that impact the Black female a little differently and maybe more heavily than others. And it is our choice how to deal with it. So yeah, it exists, and all that is true. And there is a way to work above it, so to speak.
Mm-hmm.
Like, we don't have to dive into that, but if you don't see it and you're not looking at it from a strategic perspective, then you're just lost in it. And it can be devastating to the spirit and also to the body.
Yeah. Yeah. I guess like one thing that you mentioned, the challenges or the toll that that experience or that adversity could sometimes have on you. And I think just to kind of ask a question that could apply to, again, so many different groups, how do you feel so comfortable taking your identity and making it this, I'd say like the centerpiece of a project that you've created? Because that is tough to like to have your identity be something that's so core to the work that you're putting out there too. How do you do that? I would almost say, how do you get the courage or to take your personal struggle and experience and make that part of your work?
Matt, let's talk about that.
Yeah.
So that is what gives me courage, right? The relief of that burden just gave me courage. It made me lighter.
Wow.
So I don't carry it anymore.
Wow.
And it can be a gift for others to do the same. So when women share with us, the one thing I always try to say, and I'm pretty sure I do, is thank you for being brave enough to share your story. You know, I will say one of the other things I've said in an interview and on one of our podcast episodes, like yourself, I had a loss. Right? My dad passed away, and the most difficult thing I ever did since then was document my story. It was the most emotional, reliving all of those things and digging into and facing myself was very difficult emotionally. And it also, at the end of the day, opened the door for so many other people to kind of do the same. Usually when we talk to women, they'll say, oh, I don't have anything to share. You know? And then like 3 months later, they might call or reach out. Oh, you know, I think something did happen. It usually takes about 6 months before someone could get to the point where they were writing or agree to have a conversation. And it's because we are messaged that those things, they're personal, but also we don't have the right to talk about our pain. And certainly not in the workplace. I mean, that's kind of a across the board thing. But as soon as you talk about Blackness or female being a unique experience, people want to shut it down as somehow it's not true. So my lived experience isn't true. So I had to, in order to be kind of liberated or free from that, I had to say it out loud. And that's the other thing. It was a motivator for creating the project. Was I would meet with my friends. This is no lie. Like I put this in something else. Like we would literally whisper in corners, like go out and for happy hour, whatever, and whisper about like, yo, like this is happening at work. What's going on with you? And we talk about like, well, what are you taking? Are you taking like this herb or that herb? Like, how are you? Oh, you're seeing a chiropractor and an acupuncturist? Okay, great. Like, can you give me their name?
Wow.
Just to manage the stress. And inevitably, somebody would get laid off 6 months later, right? Because either there's no more grant funding or, there's a reorg. Basically, they kept getting pushed out. And so I knew that I couldn't sit in a corner and whisper anymore because oppression will continue if people don't say something. So this is one way for me to liberate myself, but also a way like we have to say it out loud. Otherwise it doesn't exist.
Yeah.
It's just internal. I had one woman, she worked in finance and risk management or something for most of her career. and then told me, look, I don't care what you do with my story. I just don't want to carry it anymore.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, that sounds common too. I think a lot of people struggle with, um, well, this might be a different thing. Maybe it's not necessarily about identity. Maybe it is. I don't know. But a lot of people struggle with hearing their own voice, hearing their own words, their identity. And so I think it's important that you're giving people that space. I guess one thing I want to ask, just as we're talking about the impacts that you're having, I'm curious, what is the vision that you have, not just for Black Female Project, because I get, you were there before it, you will be there after that, and so I'm wondering, what is the vision and the impact you want to have in general, whether that's in people's lives, in our world, what's on your mind? I want to have the exclusive take on the difference you're working to make.
Where I've landed lately is a phrase around a place where kind of marketing, images and language and all of that doesn't cause harm. So if we look at everything, every campaign, every message in a way that is designed to uplift whomever, just don't cause harm to someone else along the way.
Yeah.
So, and that's kind of my lens overall. So if I were looking at Black Female Project as not my personal journey, but like a project, then it is about shifting the narrative and changing the narrative about Black women within themselves, and then to the greater audiences. Like, we aren't helping to perpetuate and causing harm by not speaking up, like by negligence, by sometimes people are so hurt, it takes other people. We've had people, I'm gonna divert just a sec. We have had people call who wanted to participate, who were so traumatized that all we could do is listen. They could not function in a conversation with other women because they were just in like current trauma. So that said, I'd say it's important. Let me not forget the direct question, which was around, the vision. Yeah, like giving voice. Really, it's about finding my voice, helping other people find theirs through whatever mechanism that is, whether it's Black Female Project or through my work in marketing and communications with organizations. Just like, tell the truth. Because if you tell the truth, it can lead to healing. And if you have healing, you can be liberated from whatever that thing is that might be holding you back or doesn't let you talk or doesn't let you see yourself. The other thing that we found along the way is, like, when we do panels or talk to women, is a lot of times women, and maybe this is true for men too, is they don't see themselves through their own eyes. So it's always an assessment of, well, my boss will think this, or my boyfriend will think this, or my, whatever that is, that kind of lingering essence. But if you don't love what you see in the mirror, like, and see it, that creates a barrier. Yeah. And so sometimes it's just like, look in the mirror and remember, to love yourself.
Yeah. I mean, it's funny because I think sometimes the deepest advice is the most simple, straightforward, common, but we overlook that advice oftentimes, or we don't hear it for whatever reason because we're so busy, thinking about what our boss or whoever it is thinking. And so I think that's a great piece of advice too. One thing I want to ask, because
I'm going to write down a quick question because I have one for you too.
Oh yeah, please. Yeah, and I guess we could dive right into it. This is a conversation.
You ready? Okay.
Yeah, go ahead.
So my question is, what about what we've talked about so far has really resonated with you? Because we have lots of different people who work on a project on the back end, maybe editing, doing digital work, and every single person, the person who transcribes the stories, no matter what ethnicity or gender, they all take something away from it. I'm curious what's resonating for you.
You know what? The part that resonates with me, I think, most is the part that I think people could, if it's someone who has never met a Black woman in their lives, I think they could just attach onto. Because I'm always thinking, again, as a marketing communications person, about like audience, and does the person I'm talking to understand what I'm saying, or like how do I get what's up here through to the other person? And I think, and maybe it's probably because you also just said it, because there's a lot that resonates with me in what you're saying. But I think just this part about telling your truth and living your truth is so important. And specifically, I think there's also this other piece that's a lot more difficult with that. So I think, in short, telling the truth is easy for people. They say, great, I won't lie. But it's not that simple. You need to understand your truth. And I have a friend, Roxanne Stafford, who is a Black woman, who said to me that she feels really like Black people in particular, and Black women, have this ability to kind of this sight that a lot of other people don't see. And so that's to say that I think you and a lot of the women you've had conversations and featured conversations or writing with kind of see things, I would say clearly, at least from my perspective. But there are a lot of people, especially those in positions of privilege, who don't see that, who can't see, they can't see things maybe from an objective perspective, or from a perspective that considers that your truth is different than their truth. And so that's the part that I think that resonates with me most. Other than just the specific stories, like, I've appreciated you sharing those specifics, because I think that that's what people also could relate to and latch on to. People could relate to thinking about what their boss or their whoever it might be, thinking of what that person thinks of them. Like you said, that is something that Black women face. But also, I think everyone could relate to the idea of caring a lot, if not too much, what other people think. And so that's what resonates with me so far. I'm glad you asked, though, because it's a good way to, it kind of leads into one of my last questions, which is about kind of just summing up your story in a way. And it's a question I ask everyone at the end toward the end of these interviews. But I wonder, like, if your life were a book or a documentary, what would that title be, Precious, and why?
So, of course, I've given this a little bit of thought, and
Yeah.
you know what? I don't. Where I'm landing is something around flow and not fight. Right? Like, when I get from the point where I'm flowing and not fighting, and of course, this didn't come from. It's the age-old thought about, like, just be resonant. Like, all the things around us are distractions from what our kind of like what our purpose is. Like, we hear people talk. I remember growing up and people would say, follow your dreams and you'll have everything you need. And I'm like, whatever, like, for real. And now here I am, really literally kind of midlife-ish, and thinking, wow, I think they were right. I think they were right, because if you are aligned with your natural talents, it doesn't always feel like work.
Yeah.
Great. So I would say that it would either be something around flowing and not fighting, or even about just something around evolution and distinction. But I couldn't come up with a clever title yet.
No, I think flow, not fight, or So I that's what I was just imagining that it was, based on what you were saying. And I think that's really beautiful, because it's so strange. Like, as throughout all this conversation, despite like all the pieces that I feel like I could relate to, the one piece that what you were just saying actually just struck me. Like, honestly, I felt myself getting a little emotional thinking about it, because I mentioned before that we started that, I've had times where I've wanted to start a project or start something. And I think a lot of people who are watching can probably relate to that. You want to start something, but then, work comes up or life comes up and you, for whatever reason, you don't continue to do what you want to do. And then I look at 180 degrees of impact in my example. You know, we all have, you have your examples and you know, we all have ours. But for me, it is like bizarre that I've had like more than 24 hours worth of conversations at this point. I have to do the math again, but it's like how like I don't know how I could be so I'm in awe of the ability to, like, for anyone to dedicate themselves so much to creating things. But I'm in awe of what you do, but then I think of the fact that, like, it's not work. I'm just talking, and I clearly like to talk. So yeah, you have to flow, not fight. And I think you have to do what you love and follow your dreams. And it's a cliche, but I think maybe what I was thinking as you were saying that was that I think the reason why people kind of look at that advice and kind of maybe roll their eyes is that so many people are discouraged from following their dreams that, you know, they don't fully believe in their ability to achieve. And so they, you know, following their dreams, or what they think is them following their dreams, even though they're not fully committed, doesn't work out because they don't actually believe. And so that's a deep conversation. I think we could go into that a lot, but I think there's so much that people could learn from you, and also from all the people that you've featured so far through Black Female Project. I want to know, how could anyone who's watching learn more about you and the work that you're doing? What website links or social media? Where should people look? Where are the key places?
Thank you, Matt. Well, people can learn more on our website. Everything's there. Our Support Us page is there. If you want more stories, we do that. It's a volunteer-run organization, and you know, contributions really matter. So blackfemaleproject.org. There are stories there. There's a link to the podcast episodes. There's also personal narratives and interviews are there. Bios of some of the women. We have another set. So the first 9 stories will come out this year. The second 9 or 11 will come out the following year, and then we'll probably go ahead and publish like a coffee table book with that first set. Yeah. And we also, you know, we've been working on a gallery kind of exhibition. I have this vision that you'll walk into a space and you'll hear Black women's voices, and girls can talk to Black women and see Black women in all these different kinds of professions. And that's the other thing, is I think we're so busy with our heads down working that, and you know, there's a fast pace all around, that sometimes girls just don't see enough of us. Like, they don't see our faces, they don't hear our voices. And that's important given the structures with, you know, just the way the numbers shake down, right? Like, there's pockets where you can go and you see Black professionals at all kinds of levels. And then there are other places you can go where you just don't. Yeah. The young people there need to see themselves. Yeah. Yeah. You know, the other thing, our research, so we had a researcher, Dr. Tamika McGlon, who is doing an assessment of our first kind of 3.5 years. And her findings will come out, and it might be, you know, like, she'll tell, I may not have been the most research sensitive, right? Like, I was doing my own informal research. So one of the things that she shared, though, that I thought really stopped me in my tracks, similar to what you just described, is that, Precious, what you have to remember is that the majority of women do not have this story of thriving at work. And we still have to dig into why and what that means. And so I look forward to sharing her findings early in the fall, and hopefully it can outline a path for some of our next direction. So, and partnership, that's the other thing. So we do live events. We have had live events in Washington. We had a conversation series in New York City, a conversation series in Washington, D.C., and a conversation series in the Bay Area. We probably will launch those again in the coming year. It'll be our 5th year anniversary next year. So we're looking to do some really exciting partnership development, because we know the only way we will sustain is through partnership. And the last thing I would add is that we also do industry-specific conversations.
Mm-hmm.
So Black teachers, we're going to do a partnership with Black artists, and we've talked about finance and corporate, leadership.
Mm-hmm.
If you or your organization wants to host one of these conversations, I think that is a phenomenal way for an organization to say, you know what, we value the voices of women, we value the voices of women of color. Have one of your people in the panel or in the conversation, and then invite Black women to have a protected space where other people can observe. We've done observed conversations, but it's really about saying, I care about your voice enough that I'll listen. And that goes a long way. That kind of, some people call it ceremony, some people call it a sanctuary, but really, like, we work hard to make sure the women who are willing to share, because about that courage, right? Like, people didn't speak up because they paid a price for speaking up. That's why people didn't.
Yeah. I think that's amazing, though, and we will talk definitely another time about how 180 degrees of impact could be part of that here in Washington, D.C. or otherwise, because I think one thing that I pride myself on, I guess that I haven't really talked about specifically, but it's just that I have a project that isn't, it's not, it's about people who are making an impact, but I also think it's really important to have a space to make the space that, well, I'll say in general that different people deserve, but for me in particular, to make space that Black women deserve in the project for Black women. And so I think, it doesn't, one lesson that I've learned from talking with you is that, sure, you could make a project that's focused on that, and that is important, but also anyone, like a workplace, could host an event, co-hosting with you or partnering with you in that sense. And that's a way of them taking a step and showing support, even though they're not dedicating their entire mission to really addressing a lot of the issues that Black women in particular might be faced with or thrown onto their backs, so to speak, like the brick analogy I was giving before. But I'm excited about all that you're accomplishing, and I have to always say at the end of these interviews, for anyone who wants to learn more about 180 degrees of impact, www.lets.care, at Let's You Care on social media. hello@lets.care is the email address if anyone ever wants to reach me. And Precious, this has been great. I really appreciate you, and I appreciate what you're doing, and I just want to say thank you. And to tie it in with the phrase that I always end my interviews with, I want you to keep up the amazing work, and I want you to keep impacting. Thanks again.
Thank you, Matt. Thanks so much. Congratulations on the project.
Thank you.